A few weeks ago in a sermon, I made the statement that a particular form of hatred is probably the oldest, longest-standing form of systemic hatred known to human beings. One of my daughters, who was present in worship that day, offered a gentle but clear correction. "Dad, I get what you were trying to say," she said, "but anti-Semitism is not the oldest, longest-standing form of systemic hatred. It is misogyny." I would say that I hate it when she's right, but that would just further reinforce her point. And anyway, her point seems to be reinforced in hearing a story today about a woman in a house sick with a fever who, after being healed by Jesus, immediately gets up and begins to serve all those male disciples standing around doing nothing. The woman has been down for the count with a fever. They ought to be serving her. And yet the service that this healed woman provides immediately for the disciples gathered in her home comes from the word diakoneo, from which we derive the word deacon, one who serves or ministers to others. This is the second time this word appears in the first chapter of Mark. The first time was right at the beginning when Jesus was driven into the wilderness by the Spirit, where the angels waited, diakoneo, waited on him. In other words, Simon's mother-in-law's diakoneo, her ministry, is the model response to the new life that God gives to her that day. It is Jesus' disciples, on the other hand, who miss the assignment, a theme that will only grow stronger the deeper we get into Mark's gospel. The unclean spirits and demons know who Jesus is before his own disciples do. The mother-in-law, who is not named a disciple, shows the disciples and everyone else what true discipleship looks like. This new arrangement of power where those who are considered less than wind up leading the way in the realm that is breaking into the existing way that things are. It is the content of the preaching that Jesus tells his disciples he is here to do. And their slow uptake seems to reinforce the idea that in order to comprehend this changed life that Jesus is promising to all of us, much less receive it ourselves, we need to hear it proclaimed. We need to see it enacted. We need to see others responding to it in the right ways. It's that trifecta of preaching, enacting, and observing others living lives of discipleship that gives us a chance to receive something the same. Yet there's something that struck me as a contradiction in that life of service this week as I noticed Jesus running off to a deserted place to pray by himself. The disciples notice it too. The text says that Simon and his companions hunted for him. Other translations say searched for him. But the Greek word here is much more hostile. Simon and his friends are shocked that Jesus is off praying by himself while people back in town need him. They see the need and expect Jesus to address it immediately. They presume to know better than Jesus what Jesus ought to be doing. He should be here healing. He should be here casting out demons. The ones who missed the opportunity to serve earlier in the text are now the ones who presume to know where Jesus ought to be, what he ought to be doing better than he. Now, there's probably an entire sermon here about the number of times per day that each of us thinks we know better what someone else ought to be doing. Energy that we spend judging others that is better spent on self-examination. But we all know Lent will be here soon, so I'll save the thank God I'm not like the tax collectors and sinners sermons for that season. Today I'm drawn more to how often we, like the disciples, think we know better than God what God ought to be doing. Now, I have lots of thoughts daily about what God ought to be doing. Those thoughts usually involve curing people of afflictions and afflicting some other people, usually politicians, with painful punishments that they deserve, taking care of business so that we don't have to. My latest hostile thoughts about what God ought to be doing occurred while getting an MRI last week for what could have been a new round of a different cancer than I've had in the past. It turned out to be a false alarm, but before I knew that, while lying on that table, inside that cold, claustrophobic tube, I kid you not, listening to Bobby McFerrin in the headphones singing "Don't Worry, Be Happy," I had the thought, Jesus, if I have cancer again, I'm going to be really pissed off at you. That thought was nearly immediately judged and displaced by the second thought that I had managed 50 years of a pretty good life while we were on the cusp of burying Kaylee at age 29. And yet, far from engendering thankfulness, that thought just made me mad at God all over again. It is pretty hard to lie completely still for magnetic imaging while silently seething with God. Then I remember Jesus running off to pray by himself. I don't know about you, but usually I think of Jesus sort of like a passionless monk, perfectly calm, at ease, at one with the world, a person who'd have no trouble lying still in that tube. I'm not sure where I got this image of Jesus, since we all know that this is the one who turns over tables, shouts down demons, and weeps over Jerusalem. I just know that this image of Jesus has given me the warped idea over the years that getting to a place where I don't feel anything should somehow be a goal in life. But watching the crowds clamor for healing on demand, and the disciples sit on their butts while a recently healed old woman serves them, all the while insinuating that they know better than Jesus himself what Jesus ought to be doing, I realize that Jesus, like me, like you, probably sometimes needs a place to put his anger. Anger that unclean spirits and demons exist and have to be dealt with. Anger that disciples don't do the discipleship they're supposed to be doing. Anger directed toward God, which when it comes to Jesus means anger directed at oneself. And whether that anger is justified or not is sort of beside the point. If you don't have a place where you can put it, have it held and heard, it makes it hard to keep doing the healing. Keep serving others. Keep holding other people's pain. Unfortunately, Mark is very sparse on most details, including the details of what Jesus prayed that day. But I think that we can reasonably assume that the Jesus who cries out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" is pretty comfortable voicing displeasure with the world as he finds it. And the community that Jesus experiences within the total life of God, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, is sufficiently strong to contain his anger and pain so that it never poisons his heart for healing, nor does it ever diminish his penchant for preaching the world as it should be, the world as it is to come. Jesus returns from that prayer in the darkness, determined to continue and expand his ministry for another day. We all need that kind of community, a place to put our anger and pain. Rabbi Sharon Brous recently described a sort of template for this kind of community from an ancient pilgrimage described in an obscure text from the 3rd century Mishnah. Several times each year, she writes, hundreds of thousands of Jews would ascend to Jerusalem, the center of Jewish religious and political life. They would climb the steps of the Temple Mount and enter its enormous plaza, turning to the right en masse, circling counterclockwise. Meanwhile, the brokenhearted, the mourners, and here I would also include the lonely and the sick, would make the same ritual walk, but they would turn to the left in the opposite direction, every step against the current. And each person who encountered someone in pain would look into that person's eyes and inquire, "What happened to you? Why does your heart ache?" "My father died," a person might say. "There are so many things I never got to say to him." Or perhaps my partner left. I was completely blindsided. Or maybe my child is sick. We're awaiting the test results. Those who walked from the right would offer a blessing. "May the Holy One comfort you," they would say. "You are not alone." And then they would continue to walk until the next person approached. Rabbi Brous says that one piece of wisdom derived from this text is that while we can't normally fix another's pain, the act of showing up for them serves as a reminder that even in the worst of situations, we are not completely helpless. Human connection is possible and real. But she also argues that this kind of attention to others' suffering guards against the perils of tribalism, so dangerous and so pervasive in our time. One of the greatest casualties of tribalism, she says, is curiosity. And when we are no longer curious, when we don't try to imagine or understand what another person is thinking or feeling or where her pain comes from, our hearts begin to narrow. We become less compassionate and more entrenched in our own worldviews. Trauma, she says, exacerbates this trend. It reinforces an instinct to turn away from one another rather than make ourselves even more vulnerable. The church is invited to be this kind of community. To make it work, we have to show up for each other. If you only come to church when you need something, there will never be enough people here who are in a position to give. Or if you always hide your pain, because that's what some of us were taught to do in church, let's be honest, pretend that you are more put together than you actually are. Well, the anger and the pain will just metastasize into something more like resentment, bitterness, or loneliness. Showing up is what allows this miracle of enough to happen. Enough healing and help for whatever moment we are in. We are, after all, shaped by the one who managed to extend healing at the same time that his heart was breaking. In his public life, he appeared to walk clockwise, doling out healing and helping those headed the other way. Yet in his prayer life, I suspect that he went the other way, letting those prayers of protest and pain fly from his lips with abandon. God seems to know that far from leading us astray, this is what keeps us sane and healed enough ourselves so that we too can be a blessing to others.